Hello watch enthusiasts! Now a few days ago Omega released the information that this year they're going to be recreating the Caliber 321, their famous chronograph movement from the original Moonwatch. And this has come as very major news to a lot of people, and is something completely unheard of in the industry. In fact, some people have even described this as some of the most important news in the last 20 years, which is a very important move to take for Omega, and something which is completely novel for a brand to recreate a caliber which they haven't produced for 50 years. And so in today's video, very much prompted by this new release, I'd like to talk about the history of this movement, and also the contribution this movement has made to the world of watchmaking. But also I'd like to explain why this movement was so important, because I feel that very often people simply idolise the 321 without really discussing the reason why it is such a great movement, or at least giving a valid explanation as to its influence and its contribution to the watch industry as a whole. And of course I would also like to speak about its involvement with the Speedmaster, but not exclusively, because as I will link to this video, I have produced a video of the history of Caliber 321 Speedmasters, as well as some very interesting space-related Speedmasters, so do check those out if you're interested. And of course I would also like to speak about the new 321, and what we now know at this particular point in time about what Omega are going to do with it, and also a bit of speculation regarding what they've said about the movement, and what that may well mean they're going to do with it for this 50th anniversary of the Speedmaster on the Moon. But to understand the origins of this 321, one has to look to a brand other than Omega, which was Lemania. And Lemania was formed under the name Lucrin in 1884, and it was founded by Alfred Lucrin, who'd previously worked for JLC and so had serious experience as a watchmaker. And during the early years, this manufacturer focused very much on movements with complications such as repeaters or stopwatches. And so in 1930 they were renamed Lemania by Lucrin's son-in-law, and by 1932 further changes were made as a result of the involvement of both Tissot and Omega. But in the years before becoming Lemania, Lucrin did enjoy a great deal of success and celebration as a manufacturer which won gold medals at both the 1906 Milan exhibition and also the 1914 one in Bern. Now the involvement between Omega and Lemania began in 1930, because in 1930 Omega joined with Tissot due to financial troubles and a difficult time, and so to create a sort of a union of companies. But then this was joined by Lemania in 1932 to form this trio of companies working together under the name of SSIH. But in truth it would be 10 years before these two companies worked together to create the origins of the famous 321 caliber. Because in 1942 the caliber 27 CHRO C12 was released by Lemania, and this was a movement which had been developed for a couple of years prior and which took the name more commonly of the Lemania 2310. Now the 2310 was also joined by the 3 subdial 2510, and together they formed the basis for a number of mechanical chronographs and manually wound chronographs across the 20th century from a number of very illustrious houses too. But I'll speak about what's currently available and what has been available from these brands slightly later on, because really the piece we're focusing on was released in 1946, and these came in the form of the Omega caliber 320 and 321, of which the real difference was that the 320 had 2 subdials and the 321 had the full 3. And where differences between this caliber from Omega and the original Lemania movement were concerned, one really does see very, very heavily cosmetic differences from the finishing, but also down to the elements such as the bridges, which are slightly different shapes. But in terms of the general functionality, these had very similar specifications, and so it does seem rather interesting that today one's able to get hold of 2310 or 2510 calibered watches, even in gold from Lemania, for under £2,000, making them quite an exceptional purchase if you can find a good one. But before I speak about this movement's history, I'll touch on the specifications of this movement, which make it quite so celebrated in the industry. Because the sizing of the movement is 27mm in diameter by 6.74mm thick. Interestingly, this is actually one of the defining characteristics to the naming of this movement, as is seen from Patek Philippe, but also from the original name designated by Lemania as the 27 CHRO C12. And this makes the movement quite a slender piece, but also quite a narrow movement. It has a 44-hour power reserve and 17 joules, and beat at 18,000 vibrations per hour, which comes across as rather a slow beat rate by modern standards, and is 2.5 Hz. And aside from being described as extremely well designed by a number of very eminent watchmakers, this is a movement which has a few features which are heavily praised, most notably the quality of, for example, the screws, which are extremely thick threaded, but with a very fine build to be extremely resilient and long wearing. but also it's designed as a movement which is somewhat old-fashioned in its design, with a separate cock, for example, to hold the escape wheel, but still it's a movement which has a design which has carried forward extremely well and aged very well too. One also has elements like the lateral clutch, which gives a rather beautiful engagement of the chronograph, and of course the column wheel, which gives a very crisp start to the chronograph, which was an important component in chronographs of the period, and nowadays I think has been seen more of a luxurious item or element to a movement where in fact cam-operated chronographs have become the norm, but certainly in the period this was the most effective way of starting a chronograph. Then one also has a screwed balance, which is quite an interesting touch and allows very fine regulation of the timekeeping of the watch. And bearing in mind the fact that this movement had already been produced for 11 years when the first Speedmaster hit the shelves, it's certainly true to say that this movement is more commonly seen, in fact, in Seamasters and other models in the Omega range, thus giving an interesting perspective on this movement as something far less exclusive than I think people often realise, especially when one considers the amount of spin-offs this movement has had from other brands. And for the second 11 years this watch was produced for, out of the full 22 it was made, this watch was featured inside all Speedmasters from 1957 to 1965, and the Speedmaster Professional from 1965 to 1968, when it was finally discontinued and replaced. But of course what speaks volumes about the quality of this movement was its testing to be approved by NASA for space use. And of course this was the Speedmaster in the form of the ST-105.003, one of the last of the straight lugged versions, but with the white professional style hands. And this beat, it should be noted, the Rolex 6238, as well as the Longines Wittenauer 235T, which were both chronographs competing for the same title and to be allowed to go into space. And to give a run-through of what this movement was able to survive, where temperature was concerned, it was able to survive 48 hours at a temperature of 71 degrees C, followed by 30 minutes at 93 degrees C, and those are 160 Fahrenheit and 200 Fahrenheit respectively, which are very, very high movements and much higher than one would expect a movement to be able to survive without special testing. Likewise, it was held at 4 hours at 0 degrees Fahrenheit, which is minus 18 degrees C, and then it was also run through a temperature and pressure cycle, so 15 cycles of heating to 71 degrees C for 45 minutes, and then cooled to minus 18 degrees C for another 45 minutes at 10 to the minus 6 atmospheres. This same low-pressure atmosphere was used for decompression tests, where it was held at this near vacuum for 90 minutes at 71 degrees C, and then for a further 30 minutes at full 93 degrees C, really testing this movement to the extreme. The watch was also tested in a high-pressure environment of 1.6 atmospheres, which again is not enormous by comparison to a dive watch's depth rating, but still is impressive when one considers that this period of Speedmaster before the Professional didn't have an internal membrane to protect it from moisture, and so it really didn't have the same resistance as one would expect in the modern day watch. This fact is also important when one discusses the humidity tests, where it spent 240 hours between 20 degrees C and 71 degrees C in a relative humidity of at least 95%, which is an enormous sort of punishment for a watch of the period and especially a movement of the period. And it was also tested in an oxygen atmosphere for 48 hours at 100% oxygen at a pressure of 0.35 atmospheres, which is equivalent to very high altitude flight. Where kinetic abuse of these watches was interesting was the fact that this was one of the weak points of the Reissues 72s used by the competitors of this movement and this watch, which often stuttered where their second hand was concerned. And so in terms of this sort of attack to the watch, these watches had to suffer vibrations, as you would have in a spacecraft, of 3 cycles of 30 minutes, with vibrations varying from 5 to 2000 Hz, thus giving an equivalent to what would be experienced during a spacecraft launch or during flight. And then they also had to suffer acoustic noise of 130 decibels, between 40 and 10,000 Hz, during 30 minutes. And as though to finish off this abuse, it also had to suffer 6 shocks of 40 G, each lasting 11 milliseconds and in 6 different directions, and then a full acceleration of 1 G to 7.25 Gs within 333 seconds, which was a lengthways axis, so equivalent to launching a spacecraft. And of course, whilst the straight-lugged ST-105 was used by NASA for their tests, and then again was worn in the form of the ST-105.003 by Ed White for the first American EVA for Gemini 4 in June 1965, this watch was not the one which got to the moon, because that was the ST-105.012, which was worn by both Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin for their landing in 1969. And whilst this grew to 42mm, gained twisted lugs, and also had crown guards and an internal rubber membrane for water resistance, this piece still used, crucially, the famous 321 caliber, and so was using 40s technology, but extremely well designed, and as was proven by these missions, extremely robust technology, which certainly saw these watches as some of the most impressive of their period. And what is also very interesting is that NASA didn't update to later movements for the Apollo space program, because until 1972, the last Apollo mission, Apollo 17, they were still using 321 caliber Speedmasters. And this was interesting because by this point Omega had updated to the 861, or the Lemania 1872, for their manually wound chronograph, and also had now released their first automatic chronograph in the form of the caliber 1040. And so there really was a lot of variety from Omega, but NASA stuck with the traditional. And it's with Apollo 17 that really I should start talking about this new re-edition that Omega have announced. And Omega have released very few details at this stage regarding the movement, but what's interesting is of course that this movement is the same as an old one, so where specifications are concerned, I could just run on the specifications of its vintage counterpart. And Omega have pursued rather an interesting direction to find a completely original and untouched 321, because the watch they've scanned to be able to produce this project of remaking the 321 was a watch worn by Eugene Gene Cernan, one of the Apollo 17 astronauts. And they took his ST-105.003, which interestingly was a watch which was released in 1965, and so still being used in 1972 is rather interesting, and wasn't, interestingly, again, a Speedmaster professional. And so what they've done with this movement is scan it digitally to be able to create a sort of an idea of what the insides are like, and indeed to be able to scan this to be able to perfectly reproduce it in a modern form. And some changes have been made to the caliber for the modern recreation, such as the finishing. But before I speak about that, I'd like to speak about what other movements have come from the 321 to lend a bit of perspective on actually the breadth of movements which today still see an influence of this caliber. And in recent years, quite a few movements in luxury watches have been influenced or directly derived from the original 1940s Lemania design. And calibers which really stand out are models such as the Patek Philippe CH2770, seen as one of their chronograph movements, which featured the original architecture of that 1940s Lemania, but of course developed to Patek Philippe's specific needs, with beveled edges, beautiful finishing, and a full reworking, such as the inclusion of solid bankings as stops for the escapement pallets, which were built into the base plate rather than being banking pins, as used with the Omega. And the reasons for this were due to the certification of this watch, and having the Geneva seal, it had to have these. And of course Patek Philippe also extended this to models such as the CH2770Q, which was their perpetual calendar chronograph, and then also the CHR2770Q, which was the perpetual calendar chronograph with the rattrapante function seen in the very highly coveted 5004 reference. And of course these were modified and so had 24 joules and 60-hour power reserves, but still were based on their original architecture. This movement also saw its use in the Vacheron Constantin 1141 and 141 ranges, also beautifully decorated, and of course finished as this house would expect them to be. And then one also has to note the use of the Lemania 2320. And the 2320 was a modified version of the 2310, which included a swan neck regulator, 21 joules instead of 17, and it ran at 3 Hz instead of running at the 2.5 Hz of the standard 2310. And most notably, this has found its way into some Breguets, as a manually wound chronograph used in some Type 20 versions over the years. But speaking of the actual modification of this movement for its Generation 2 series, which has been announced now in 2019, one can now see on the screen the watch which actually was used on Apollo 17, which as you can see has lost its bezel and uses the earlier straight lug design. But in terms of what we know about this movement at the moment, we know that its finishing is somewhat different from the original, because firstly it doesn't follow the original in the sense it doesn't have this brass sort of plating. Instead it now has a golden PVD finish to make this wonderful colour remain for much longer and make these movements more hard wearing in terms of their appearance. But also these are movements which are being issued in a rather interesting way, because nothing has been announced fully in terms of how these are going to be deployed across the Omega range, but they have said they're not going to be included in the anniversary models for Apollo 11, which is rather interesting and certainly does suggest a very interesting direction for the Speedmaster if these are put into full production within the line. An aspect which I do find rather wonderful about this is that these watches have been produced and rather redesigned and re-engineered under the project name of Alaska 11, which is rather an interesting take on the classic story of the Alaska project, watches being secret Speedmasters produced for NASA in a variety of different formats and types, which, amongst which many weren't actually used, but some did go up with the shuttle and in fact formed the basis for the design of the Speedy Tuesday Speedmaster. But what's crucial about this name is that it's historically been used to designate series of lines of Omegas which were used exclusively by NASA and also were secret in their development, and so I think it's rather appropriate to use it for another highly secretive development of this 321 caliber, which was going on completely unknown to the vast majority of us during 2 years now. And in fact, Omega have established a specific workshop to produce these movements, where any watch which will include these will be produced in its entirety, which is rather an interesting process because, of course, most watches nowadays are mass-produced, and certainly in the Omega line there is a lot which isn't produced in what you might expect in traditional ways, in the sense that not one person makes a single watch. And this really does raise the question of what I actually expect and what I would hope to see out of this new update. Because of course I think it would be almost too easy for Omega to release a short limited edition of these pieces at an extremely high price. However, Omega have said that this won't be produced in a very, very small run of watches, but will be produced for for a certain limited amount, which I think is reasonable considering the investment put into these pieces. But certainly where the development of these watches is concerned, it'll be nice to see these watches in slightly more accessible solutions, and it would be wonderful to see these replacing the 861 caliber versions as the standard production Speedmaster, although I can understand why the extra price of developing this movement perhaps might not be worth that, because the vast majority of Speedmaster buyers really don't care what the movement is, only that it is an Omega. And so whilst it remains uncertain as to what the future of this movement will hold, and certainly one won't know for the next few months, I would like to ask you, my viewers, to tell me in the comments down below what you'd like to see from this idea and this concept of remaking the 321, and what really you think would be ideal to do with it. And so with that, I'll conclude the video here, but if you enjoyed the video then do please like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and also to be able to see more videos and content here in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Arm the Watch Guy, out.